slurs, playing some notes with tongue and some notes without. When we slur between notes, we are changing notes without tonguing. But there's still some rules we need to follow about which notes do need to be tongued, and also what happens when there's just a couple of notes slurred followed by notes that are not. So we have a couple of things to talk about, but as far as note shapes are concerned, we're now thinking a little bit differently. If you think about a brick, which is a nice, long, strong sound, we actually are now playing multiple notes in one brick of sound. So these three notes all together happen within one long brick of sound, which really is air, right? This is the air that you blow. Okay, that's with tonguing, but there's no lines here, right? So there's not actually tongues here. You just blow through the notes. And that was the first thing that you heard me play. Now you can hear the precision of my fingers makes a big difference, especially on a woodwind instrument. So let's go on and talk about some situations with slurs and what it's really telling us to do. So when we play the slur game, we're always wondering to tongue or not to tongue. That is the question. When we see a slur, we need to think about each note in that group and think about which ones we will tongue and which ones we will not. So on this slur, which by the way is underneath the notes, okay? Usually it's just on the same side as the note heads, but if music looks complicated, it doesn't really matter if the slur is below or above. It's just a matter of where does it start and where does it end. Unlike other articulations, a slur contains multiple notes and changes how you play them. So we should see T for tongue. We're going to always tongue the first note in a slur, and then we do not tongue any of the other notes, so I'll put S for slur. When we change notes without tonguing, that's called a slur. Okay, we get to the next set, and now tongue, slur, slur, slur. So that's the easy part of this game, is to identify that you tongue the first one, and then you slur all the rest. And then if a new slur begins, you got to tongue again, and then slur all the rest. So that is the question. Let's look at another example here. First, the music, right? So this song should be familiar. Here it is with no slurs. So that was with no slurs. I just played the notes. If I look at this music and these slurs are there, I need to play the game. To tongue or not to tongue? That is the question. So here's my first slur here. I know I need to tongue the first note and slur the next note. Here's another one. Tongue, slur, tongue, slur. And if I haven't done this before, doing this pattern of tongue, slur is actually going to take a little bit of practice, right? I'm not necessarily going to be good at that right away. So here's the first one. I'm just going to practice that. Tongue, slur, and just get used to those sounds. I have to blow continuously and just let my fingers change without interrupting the sound. Here, I'll try another pattern of notes, just these two together. Just trying to get used to ta, tongue, slur, ta. I don't tongue anywhere that it says slur, right? If it's under this nice smooth connection, it doesn't get a tongue, only the first one. So here's the whole song now with the slurs. Kind of biffed the last one, but you can hear how it groups them together. So these two notes now sound really connected to each other because they are, right? Because I played them without a tongue. There was no separation. It was just one note straight into the next note. So now let's take a look at what the air is doing while we're playing a slur. We've got 4/8 notes right here. We'll talk about these little tenuto marks in just a minute. we've got a long series of eighth notes and 16th notes, and then a couple of little pairs. And what I want you to see is that when there's a curved slur, then the air for that set of notes is continuous, just like this. The only gap, or the only place where you're allowed to take a gap, is between. And certain slur patterns will have maybe a very small, just kind of a casual gap. And then there's certain slur patterns like a two-note slur, where we are sort of musically, traditionally asked to make a little more space. And you'll hear that when we get there. But the only spaces allowed in your air are where there's gaps between the slurs. See how this gap between those slurs matches with this gap in the air. So before we actually hear any of these notes, right? 1 and 2 and 3 and a 4, and before I play any of those, I need to think about blowing continuous air through the different groupings of slurs. Ready, and so you'll notice there's not a very noticeable gap between these two. But when I get to the two-note slurs over here, dia, 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 I leave this space in between. And that's just because the two-note slur has a particular feel. It's heavy on the first one, lighter on the second one, almost like a tenuto and a staccato. But we play the first one a little stronger, and then the second one a little more relaxed. And then we leave a big gap before we jump on to the next note. So listen to this example one more time. Ready, and so here it's going to feel less smooth, and that's because repeated notes are tricky. You can't play repeated notes without tonguing, and so these tenutos are there to kind of represent how we lightly tongue them. Ta da 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 ta da. Then we can actually slur. Ta 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 ta. So the key there is, instead of thinking two two or ta 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 when you play your notes, that we have one T, ta, and then a big long ah, which represents the air. Ta. Makes sense when we look at the note shape. Ta. Right? There's no tongue to split these notes up. The split happens when you change your fingers. And there's actually quite a bit of variation to how we actually blow, but that comes through musical practice. So when I play this, I go ta, and that's something I call shaping, which creates a little bit of a coolness inside that pattern of notes. But that can be very different depending on the music, and that's sort of a different topic. But this is how we approach slurs. So we should only be tonguing once per pattern, right? I tongue here and slur the rest. I tongue here and I slur the rest. I tongue here, I tongue here, I tongue here, and then the rest is tongue. And notice how that tongue is the beginning of each stream of air, right? These match up. So the idea up here is you're blowing through the notes, playing a long series of air. Finally, I wanted to talk about something trombone players have to deal with. So trombones, this is just for, between you and me, the trombone player's secret that the audience should never know. Trombones are not allowed to just not tongue. They can't just decide not to tongue to make a slur, because it'll sound like this. This is kind of a funny little musical example, but you can't just not tongue, because if you just blow like I showed in the last picture on the last slide, then you're going to get the slide or the glissando sound between your notes. So we don't want that all the time. We only do that in special situations. So trombone players use a secret, right? They use legato tonguing, which is that instead of tonguing with a T, we tongue with the letter D, which I sort of mentioned on the previous page when we had repeated notes. So other instruments have to learn how to do this. So instead of thinking T for tongue, When we're trying to slur, think of like a very light letter D. So yes, we're going to tongue the first note because it's the beginning of a long slur, but then all of these have a do 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 do. Right? These are supposed to be do 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 do. And the slide has to be super fast because if you're too late, then the notes won't sound connected. I'll give it a try. See what I did there? Listen again. Now, I just played that for the first time, so I need a little bit of practice to actually get all my notes to sound connected. I'm trying to trick anybody who might be listening into thinking that I'm truly slurring the notes. And this is the best we can get as trombone players. So we tongue just like everybody else tongues, but where everybody else would get the S for slur and just not tongue, trombones don't get to do that. We have to use do, 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 and a very light legato tongue in order to make the effect. So that's a special secret for trombone players. And that's all you need to know to get started and practice your slurs.